Hi there, everyone. My name is Michael Riveros, and I'm part of the National Training and Technical Assistance Center team. Today, I'll be joined with my colleagues, Dr. Pamela Trivedi and Dr. Shai Porter. Welcome to today's Provider and Education Wellbeing meeting. And today we're going to continue along the series that we have started with teacher wellness and support wellness. And so the materials that you will see are presented in cooperation with Georgetown University and some of our partners. And we have the place where you can get the information about that if you like. Next slide. This material was presented under a partnership, is what this disclaimer says. And it's important to know that SAMHSA is one of our funders. And so I'd like to do a little overview about who we are at the National Training and Technical Assistance Center at Georgetown. We are a collaborative of organizations, and I think on this slide, typically we have our partners, but we can go to the next slide and see. Our multidisciplinary team includes the Center for Applied Research and Solutions, also known as CARS. We have the American Academy of Pediatrics. We have the Family-Run Executive Director Leadership Association. Because we are a system of care, support, technical assistance place, Youth Move is a very important partner. And the really neat thing about this is if you contact us for technical assistance, you get so many different disciplines that will come together to make sure that we give you the technical assistance that you need from a perspective that is going to be meaningful and useful. An example of that is that we're currently working with the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes, because if you consider the wake of the news in the last couple of weeks, the shooting has really weighed heavy on this particular partner in their response to that. And so I will share with you some of the ways that we do that when I address that. And so the next slide, please. Our goal is, and I can't say this enough, is that all children, youth, young adults, and families with emotional or behavioral health needs can access evidence-based treatment and recovery services in a well-coordinated system of care. And you know, we are all a part of that system of care. And so we're so happy and excited to have everyone who is here. And one of the cool things about this work is that I'm from New Orleans originally. I see it kind of as a gumbo. You have so many different parts of what is coming together when you think about disciplines, or you think about where people are in the system. And they all are equally important. Family voice, the youth voice, the eggheads like myself who look at this and try to figure out, ways to present it. Everybody comes together in a team to wrap around the family, if you will, really important. And so it's really just about anyone who is interested in supporting a system of care. And it doesn't have to be a formal system of care. It doesn't have to be an active system of care. We have graduated communities. We have people who have worked in system of cares, who have moved, and they've seen the benefit of looking at service provision that way. And so, if you contact us, we'll sit down with you and figure out a way to make sure that you get the assistance that you need. Again, our goal is to make sure that children, youth, and families have the best services. This is another way of showing you the services that we have: individual consultation, peer learning exchanges like we're doing right now, customized coaching. There are practical tools for looking at sustainability, for example, practical tools for mapping out who partners are that we can help with. Podcast, we have a 5 Things Digest, and then community of practice, again, what we're doing right now. These are your facilitators, Dr. Shai Porter, myself, and Dr. Pamela Trivedi.
So what you're looking at is a questionnaire called the Positive Ways of Working Through Stress. Obviously, stress is a major component of what we're talking about today. Okay, so what you would have seen had you been able to complete it, which hopefully you will be able to do later, are your scores for 4 different sections. The first one refers to healthy alternatives for coping through stress, right? So letting your feelings out in a safe place / way, or using a substitute healthy activity to help clear your mind, doing exercise, working out in some way, listening to music, etc. Those are all considered healthy alternatives to working through the stress that you might be feeling in any given moment. Questions number 7 through 12 reflect your ability or your tendency to use reframing as a tactic for managing stress. So accepting the next best thing to what you wanted, or looking at it in a different way, looking for the positive or the good in the situation, thinking about lessons that you learned or could learn as a function of this experience. Maybe even joking about the situation and trying not to take it so seriously. That's all considered reframing. 13 to 18, the green section refers to problem solving. So here we're focusing on concentrating on what needs to happen next. What's the next step? Figuring out how to analyze the problem in order to explore the additional options that might be available to you. Maybe thinking about how others are perceiving or addressing the problem, trying to see things from another person's point of view. And then this last section in pink / red is considered social support as a way, and that refers to utilizing the people in your network in order to help you work through stress. So that might mean accepting understanding of the situation, whatever it is, and getting support from someone else. Talking to someone who could do something about the situation. You know, when we're younger, that usually means our parents or a teacher or some other sort of authority figure. Talking to someone about how you're feeling. Could be a partner, could be a therapist, could be a colleague, could be a boss, etc. Asking someone who you respect for advice, and maybe even thinking about how a person you admired would handle the situation. And that could include talking to that person, or it could be, saying, what would Oprah do? Or what would Barack Obama do, or some other person that you admire. Okay, so I wanted to just go through these different ways in more detail because they are deserving of that. There are different ways of coping, as you all know. We can broadly categorize them into the unhealthy and the healthy pile. There are 4 very effective ways of dealing with stressful situations. And while we will all like to think that when we plan for something accordingly, we put enough effort into it in advance, nothing bad will happen. The reality is, we're all adults. We know that you can have the best planning experience in the world, and yet when the situation arises, something goes wrong. And hopefully it doesn't happen majority of the time in your life, but it certainly happens at least some of the time to all of us. So it's important to think about in advance, how can we cope should something not go the way that we hope? So as I mentioned in the previous slide, doing something that is healthy and positions you to function better is the purpose of that alternative activity. So we know that exercise is hugely critical for changing the neurotransmitters in your brain, releasing more dopamine, releasing more serotonin, so that you are able to, even just through physical activity, get to a better place around how you're thinking about something and experiencing something. You can do all sorts of other positive activities. Reading can be very meditative and cathartic for people. Of course, actually meditating is very cathartic for people. Journaling, taking a walk, listening to music, etc. What we want to remember here is that we want to avoid doing things that numb the sensation. So not using substances, not drinking, not sleeping the issues away. Sometimes taking a nap can be helpful, but using it as your primary coping strategy is not ideal, because when you wake up, that problem is still there. An important thing to note about these activities also is that they can be used before a situation happens. So before some big thing that you're anticipating happens, it might be good to go for a walk, to journal, to meditate, just to get yourself in the right headspace. And should things not go the way that you'd hoped, they're an alternative that you can easily reach for, maybe because you've just done it before the actual event came about. The second important way of coping is reframing the experience, right? So thinking about how the experience affects you, how can you maybe accept the situation, thinking about how you learned from it, recognizing the parts of the situation that can be changed, while also recognizing things that you can't change. Back in my clinical training, we talked a lot about this idea of radical acceptance, which really refers to the sense that there are going to be situations that are really hard to shift, that just are what they are. So radical acceptance is getting to a point where you say, I understand that my control is very limited here. And even though this is not ideal, I'm going to accept this radically. And I'm going to figure out how I can make the situation work despite it being really difficult. Figuring out what you can learn from the experience is a big part of that process, right? Like making it a learning opportunity is almost always helpful. Using self-talk, and then of course reflecting. Why did this happen? What might have contributed to it, etc. It's also nice when you're in this reframing space to think about what the successes were in the experience. Maybe the whole thing wasn't terrible. Maybe there were some things that did go well, it did go according to plan. And then figuring out how you can take those successes and make this maybe a positive learning experience overall. When we think about teachers in classrooms, sometimes students get very unruly. That's just part of being in a school environment. And so if you take students getting unruly as this is terrible, I'm horrible at my job, etc., that's going to make for a very difficult and perpetually stressful experience, as opposed to saying, okay, my students are getting unruly predictably in these situations. What can I do to make it so that this unruly behavior comes up much less or is eliminated entirely? So every time I turn around to write something on the board, students start talking. Perhaps that means I should give them something to keep them busy while I turn around to write on the board. All right, so we're really trying to reframe and figure out, okay, what is something that I could do differently? And, what are maybe some positives of the situation? It's good that the students are jovial enough and close enough to want to talk to each other the way that they do. How can we make it a more positive experience? And then there's problem solving, which is almost always relevant for any stressful situation. What can we do differently? What can be ideally better? What parts of the situation are within our control? One of the most important things with problem solving is breaking things down into their component parts. Sometimes when we look at a situation as one entire behemoth, it can feel very overwhelming and as though you can't do anything. But if you break it down and say, okay, step one, problem number one within this entire situation is this. Is there something I can do to address issue number one before moving on to step number two? Really thinking about what is within my control helps people feel like they have a handle on the situation in a way that might be difficult if you're just looking at the whole thing as one behemoth, as I said. One example that we have here is thinking about students being disrespectful, and then maybe saying, like I could take the path of being perpetually offended and saying these students are disrespectful. Maybe they don't respect me as a teacher because I'm really bad at my job, or maybe they're just terrible kids, etc. That's one path. But the other path is utilizing the people in your life to think about, which ties into social support, to think about what can I do differently, or even sitting down in your planning period and saying, okay, this is a perpetual issue that keeps arising. Can I do something differently that the students won't expect and that I feel confident about having a positive outcome? What's within my purview to change? And then finally, there's social support. So asking other people how they see the situation, soliciting feedback from other people, getting a reality check. Oftentimes we're too close to our own stuff to really have a good sense of what's going on. And so getting some perspective from other people can really go a long way. Thinking about, if you're in a school setting, fellow teachers or fellow clinicians in that setting might be your natural go-to. But really thinking about who might have other useful input. Maybe it's the school principal, maybe it's the janitor, who knows? But really expanding the frame and thinking about who are all the people who can provide social support. Maybe you have teachers in your family who can also give you some perspective. And then thinking about if you can partner with other people around whatever might be going on to help manage the situation. Identifying allies, identifying toxic influences, removing those toxic influences, talking to veterans in the field can all be very, very helpful. And then I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the unhealthy ways of coping. One is denying. For example, if your students are talking too much or they're being disrespectful, continuing to do what you're doing as though it's not happening is not going to make the situation better. You can also act as though the experience never occurred. That's also, again, not realistic. It did happen and you will eventually have to face it. It's just a matter of when. And the faster you can deal with it head on, the better. The other things that are things that we want to avoid is, not putting yourself in a situation where you not only avoid the situation that's happening, but also avoiding anything similar to it. For example, this is out of the purview of a lot of people here, but just broadly speaking, this might be applicable. Public speaking. Public speaking, I think, if I remember correctly, is the #1 fear, even above death on the globe. And that is significant. And so what a lot of people who have public speaking anxiety will do is say, I'm never speaking in public again, once they get through periods of life where they have to, like being in school, etc. And I will go to my grave never having done this. And what that does is create this atmosphere of anxiety around public speaking that's so much bigger than the act itself. That is what we would consider an unhealthy way to cope. So what I want you all to remember is numbing or blunting your reactions, denying what you're feeling about something is not helpful. Leaning into it instead is critical. Using your social support system to help you problem solve, to help you refrain, to help you find the alternative activities is really, really helpful. We all have different coping mechanisms. Hopefully when you do the activity that we linked, you'll get a better sense of what yours are. And then really thinking about, in the areas where you're a little bit weaker, what can you do to bolster that so that you have a variety of activities or coping strategies that are available to you for any given moment. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about the brain next. Sorry, this is just another breakdown of the various ways that we can cope with things. So again, the healthy alternative activities, exercise and dancing, music, art, writing, reframe the situation, maybe engaging in meditation, engaging in positive self-talk, problem solving, breaking down the situation, breaking down the stressor into component parts, altering the situation to the extent that you can, and then of course, getting social support and reality checking from other people. I encourage you to take a screenshot of this if you can, so that it is readily available to you when you are in a stressful situation or as you are anticipating a big event. I want all of us to go into it with the sense that practice makes permanent for our brain system. The brain becomes the brain only by making lots and lots of connections based on early experiences and then sorting out what is most important. So we have birth. We are all birthed into this world at some point, right? So we come into it with our own genetic history, our hereditary components, etc. And then we have environmental experiences that start immediately wherever we're born, water births in a hospital, birthing center, etc. And then we get a bit older, we're having all these environmental experiences. By the time we're 6 years old, our neurons have made lots and lots of connections, as you can see here. And that continues to happen into adolescence. And by the time you're 14, what you see in this little figure are myelin sheets that are covering the neurons. I'll talk about those a bit more in a second. So we have our birth experience, environmental experiences, we age, we have all sorts of inputs and outputs. Efficiency means that our brains become really good at recognizing what's important. And then by the time we reach adolescence, you are already starting to concretize those connections that you started to make. Adolescence, more than any other age group, except when you get very, very elderly, get rid of more brain cells and connections than you do at any other point of your life. So when you're in adolescence, you are pruning away like crazy to create a very efficient brain process. the things that you learned when you were younger, whether it's a new language, how to read, how to write, how to do math, etc., get concretized, not in a way that's permanent necessarily, not in a way that means it can't be altered, but gets concretized in a way that makes the glide path for the rest of your life a bit easier. So when you were young, if you were a heavy reader, reading is maybe going to be a thing that comes relatively easy to you and is of interest to you as you get older, because that has been concretized in your brain. The more things that you do frequently, the more get covered in this myelin sheet that you see under the 14-year-old column. The things that you don't do that much get pruned away, sort of like, just making sure that there is enough space for the things that you have said to your brain by doing really, really matter. And those things that really matter allow for faster and stronger connections, because those are the things that you theoretically need the most. So a phrase that appropriately conceptualizes this is neurons that fire together, wire together. So that is how each person develops their own pathways and approaches to the environment that they're in. Important fun fact, after first grade, your brain is 93% of its adult size, and it matures by becoming more connected and more specialized. Obviously, genes have a lot of say in this, but so does your environment and the decisions that you make and the events that happen in your life. So your brain will learn to specialize in whatever the thing is that you're doing the most, the things are that you're doing the most. And it's not to say that brains can't continue to forge connections in adulthood. It just means that we're less malleable and it takes more time to learn or ingrain new approaches. Learning another language at 40 is very different than learning a language at 3. All right, so I say all of this to say that when we think about healthy coping strategies, maybe we've done different things over the course of our lives that when we think about it, really aren't great ways to cope. Maybe we do nap. Maybe we nap and just nap and continue to sleep even after we should have woken up, right? To avoid whatever the situation is. Maybe we're drinking too much. Maybe we're using substances. Maybe we are just keeping our head in the sand. And that over time becomes a very ingrained way of coping. But we can shift that by being intentional, by doing it repeatedly, by practicing and making it permanent. And if you are fortunate enough to have solidified healthy coping mechanisms at this point in your life, then that is awesome. And therefore, it should be easier to keep doing those things. Then in that case, we want to bolster up the other areas, because most of us aren't great at utilizing the coping skills that are in all of those areas that I discussed, those 4 categories that I discussed. So figuring out what's lacking, what could be bolstered, and being more intentional about doing more of those things.
We can learn new coping strategies as an adult, and practice can also make those permanent. Even if we're starting with some of them late, we may have had a number of coping strategies before, but we can also sort of, engage in some of these healing centered, for some of us, the healing centered approaches are new. I know that Hope chatted something in about DBT skills, even if kind of we're learning those for clients and also kind of learning those skills for ourselves. We can learn them at different stages in our development and make them permanent. Just want to thank you for engaging with us today.